Hello, everyone, and welcome to yet another episode of Fan Fuel Motorsports Podcast. I am Alex Harrington, joined by Nathan Ball and Colton Cranmore tonight. Our fourth host, Jared Bukaiza, is not here because he is doing some Pennsylvania Speed Week stuff at Lincoln Speedway, watching the World of Outlaws. We are very jealous of that, but he's going to miss one of our greatest episodes ever. This is episode 60 with our industry/fan spotlight on Owen Kearns and Kearns, and he is a Hall of Famer from the West Coast Stock Car Hall of Fame, and he is also the 2021 winner of the Jim Chapman Award. He worked 30 years for NASCAR with different parts of the series that they have, all the way up to senior management of sports services for the series. He is currently a freelance writer and working with the West Coast Stock Car Hall of Fame. And we will get into all of that in his career a little bit later, but mostly we're going to be doing as we do and focusing on the fan side of things. So I want to welcome in our guest for tonight, Owen Kearns. How are you doing tonight, Owen?
Oh, we're just great. Living the dream out here in sunny California.
Absolutely. I did get a chance to go out there last year with some family, and that was really interesting area. It's stark contrast to living over here on the East Coast. I know we're all in 4 different places, so we all have different lives and stuff like that. But I mentioned to you before the show that I kind of got bamboozled because I saw a Twitter post from you about being at Riverside and seeing some of the great stock car drivers and some of the European guys that came over. And I was like, I've got to try and get this guy on. And I started talking to you and was like, whoa, this guy is an industry vet and someone who's been a fan of racing for so long. He's also worked and stuff. But I was just bamboozled by the fact that your Twitter name is One Old Trucker. I have got to ask, with you being, in corporate part of NASCAR and doing freelance writing and announcing and stuff like that, where did the Old Trucker username come from?
Well, we were sitting around after a race at Kansas Speedway having dinner, and a couple of us PR folks, and they suggested that I get on Twitter. And being as the fact that I was the first communications person for the currently Camping World Truck Series, I said, well, I'm the first, I'm old, and it's Truck Series, so One Old Trucker, and that's where it came from.
That makes perfect sense. All right. I want to kind of get into it. We'll all be asking you questions and stuff later on, but that's actually really cool. We'll get to the Camping World Truck Series later on in the show, but you have a just massive amount of experience when it comes to motorsports. And that's from the fan side, the industry side, and everything in between. So I have to ask you, how did you become a race fan? And then we'll get into a little bit after that. And you're on the West Coast, so it's obviously going to be different than anything from us on the East Coast.
Well, I think my first glimpse of racing was on television in the Los Angeles area. And they had live racing in the 40s and 50s from Ascot and some of the other places around Southern California. And you may at one point seen what they had a syndicated show called Jalopy Derby. Well, those were filmed live in Southern California. And I would get my folks to tune in on a Sunday afternoon and watch it. They were amazing. I mean, they stacked those cars 3 and 4 deep. But anyway, actually getting involved in the racing, though, was when my dad moved us up to Carmel Valley in 1955. And he took me out to a sports car race at Pebble Beach in the Del Monte Forest. And I guess it all went from there.
Yeah, and I wanted to ask you about that. You told me when we talked a little bit earlier this month that that was in 1955 for the SECA event in the Del Monte Forest at the Pebble Beach Street Course. Now, Pebble Beach is most known for golf. And I actually had no idea that there was racing in that area. So I did want to ask, what was it like at that event, and how was the, I guess, culture around auto racing in this area?
Well, I think that, they had the Pebble Beach Concours, which began at the same time, and it's still a very famous worldwide event with amazing cars. Of course, some of the cars that are amazing now were the ones that were brand new when they were racing there at the Forest. It was really all they did was kind of laid out snow fence to keep the fans back.
We lost him a little bit there.
Yeah, a little bit.
Saddles up around from if they get off the racetrack, but it actually, even at one point, had gravel. It wasn't totally paved all the way around, but I would hazard a guess that maybe 2,000-3,000 spectators. But it seemed like the whole forest was full of people.
Yeah. Okay. That's really interesting. So you mentioned when we talked about that you got to see the likes of Ken Miles, Phil Hill, and Carroll Shelby. So right off the bat, you were watching generational talents. They may have not come into their prime quite then, with Lamar and stuff coming later in their careers for Ken and Carroll Shelby. But how is it looking back on that, knowing that you got to see such massive influencers in not only auto racing but the automotive market taking to these street courses?
Well, I feel very, very fortunate, and I don't know, it just came together. The race that I remember in '55, it rained, and it rained pretty well. And they ran two main events. They ran an under 2,000 cc race, and they ran an over. And Ken Miles had his shingle, MG shingle, that was out there, and he won the under 2,000 cc race going away. Well, what they did was they let the guy that won that race get into the feature, and he tagged the back of the field, and as I recall, he ended up finishing second. He was an amazing talent, and he became a favorite of mine through my ensuing years. But of course, we lost him at Riverside not too many years later.
Yeah, so how does it feel, obviously for people like us who maybe didn't get to see him, we didn't really know his story until Ford versus Ferrari came out a few years ago. So how does it feel to have, you kind of saw things before he became famous, if you will?
Well, I really didn't know much about these guys. They were just names in a program. But I think I was more infatuated with the cars that they were competing in, which, as a kid, you go out to see the cars, and then you find out later that you were seeing some authentic heroes. Of course, to me, anybody that went out there and went fast like that was kind of heroic, particularly, if you made a mistake, you sometimes paid dearly for it. So I think there was that bravery involved in racing in those days that perhaps, I'm not saying the guys aren't brave now, that anybody gets in one's brave, but it was the ultimate penalty for being too much brave in those days.
Mm-hmm. So being in that area in California, that was kind of a big growing part of like racing in the U.S., especially at that time. What were some of the other races you may have gone to in your childhood or seen? What was kind of that area like when you were growing up out in California as far as racing is concerned?
Well, I never saw any racing except for the sports car races. I think the couple of races at Pebble Beach and one in Stockton, a street, wasn't a street race, but it was down around the where the ships come in and load and unload there in Embarcadero. But my folks moved us to Missouri at the end of my junior year, and there weren't any sports car races going on in Missouri at that time, but there were what they called super modifieds racing on dirt tracks, high banked, and I immediately fell in love with that, and that's where I got hooked on the stock cars.
Okay, so I have to ask about super modified. So this is something that I've recently come into knowing of just what are these things, and they look really crazy nowadays. So I know there was a big jump, specifically in the 60s, of how they modified these cars to be on the, I guess, wrong side of I guess the cockpit was shifting around. You had people putting the engines on different areas and stuff. So being able to see those live in person, how was that? Because you saw them maybe even before the boom once they transitioned to asphalt tracks. How was the super modified racing for you at that point in your life?
Well, they called them super modifieds. They were essentially jalopies, that cars that were out of the 30s, and they dropped big engines, Pontiacs, Oldsmobiles, Cadillacs into those cars, and they looked faster than you could imagine, but they were going around a high bank dirt track of a quarter mile, and they looked like they were going faster than they really were. But they were spectacular, and they usually had a lot of them, and it was quite a show, and that was kind of the trigger that said, well, there's something besides sports cars.
So one of my buddies just texted me. He's watching live right now, and he is from SoCal. And he wants to know if there were any races that you saw that were run on like the wood plank tracks from kind of back in that era.
Well, I may be old, but I'm not that old.
Yeah.
He asked. I figured they were a little older than that, but I was wondering.
Yeah, because that's about the 20s and stuff.
Back in
Yeah,
the 20s, yeah.
Yeah.
I missed that.
Yeah. Well, there you go, Derek. Your time frame's a little off.
Yeah.
Yeah. And it might be a little bit early in the conversation to ask this, but obviously the more you went into racing, the more you kind of broaden your horizons when it comes to different motorsports, different events, and all that. Is there anything in particular that you liked over the course of your career more than anything else, or were you just here for everything racing?
Well, that's the thing about getting into it from several different directions. One of the issues that I have with fans, I mean, I shouldn't have issues with fans, but it seems like they paint themselves into one corner of the motorsports universe, and they love what they're watching, but they don't much care for, what somebody else is doing. Over the weekend, people were arguing back and forth whether the Formula One race in Miami was the best thing or whether the Darlington race was a better thing. And, frankly, I watched both, not live. I watched one on, leave it to your imagination which one I watched live, but I watched the other one on tape. And they were both great races. And you enjoy them on a different level, perhaps. Darlington, obviously, not the same kind of racing as Miami was, but it's. I love all kinds of racing. Always have. Some that I love less than others, but from stock cars, sports cars, even did some stuff around air racing when I was writing a column in the newspaper, and boat racing, drag boats, open wheel, closed wheel, drag racing. It's been a real, and I think that's probably why I continue to be as interested in racing as I have been.
Is there any race in particular that sticks out to you out of all the ones you've covered? Is you could say, hey, this is my favorite race, or are there just too many to count?
Well, there are too many to count. I think my first Daytona 500 was certainly a singular event, and it happened to be the '79 Daytona 500 with the fight in turn 3 at the end, which just made it even that much more special. But the first Formula One race they had in Long Beach was fairly significant. Those were pretty spectacular. Plus the fact Long Beach hadn't modernized in those days, and those cars raced up and down next to adult theaters and old burnt out bars and that. And I'm not sure that the European folks were quite sure about that when they came over. But a couple of Indy 500s that I attended in 1978 and 1980, and the one Indy 500, I tried to convince my employers, the newspaper, that because Rick Mears was racing in the event and had qualified on the pole, that maybe we ought to go back there and cover him. Well, he decided at the last minute, yeah, you go ahead and do that. Well, I flew into Chicago, rented a car, and got down to, Indianapolis, and did not have a place to stay, and ran into Rick's brother, Roger, who had been a pretty close friend racing at the Bakersfield Speedway, where I'd been the announcer and the PR person. And I said, hey, Roger, you know a place that I can get a hotel room? And he said, oh, well, I got a rollaway bed in my room. You can stay with me. So I bunked with Roger and came out in the morning. And, at Indianapolis, they have a deal where the drivers all drive in behind the police, and they can just go right in through the crowd at 70, 80 miles an hour. Well, I just hooked my rental car into the back of the train, and there I was in the middle of the infield looking around. And so that's kind of a fun memory.
That's a pretty damn cool story. A lot of those races you just mentioned were kind of close together as far as time frame goes. Would you say that kind of late 70s, mid 70s was kind of your favorite era as far as American motorsports go?
Well, I think the 60s and into the 70s was probably the golden era of motor racing, at least in the United States, but probably in the world. And you look back at all of the drivers that competed in that era, they raced everything. They raced Le Mans, they raced Formula One. You had Formula One guys coming over and racing at Daytona. You had NASCAR guys racing in the Le Mans 24 hours. It goes on. And that's something that they don't do now. I mean, It's become so specialized, particularly with Formula One, that you don't see these guys come and compete at a race at Riverside or a race at, Watkins Glen. But, the fact that I got to see that is, I consider that I was one of the most fortunate people in the world, plus the fact I never had to pay to get in.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. I can feel you on that one.
I either worked as a turn marshal in sports car racing or announcing, and then getting into media and writing a column in the newspapers, and I got in that way on a press credential, and then of course going to work for a sanctioning body. So I tell people, hey, I never paid to get into any of the races.
Yeah. So with that being said, you obviously attended a lot of races where a lot of drivers from around the world came in, particularly, let's say, the Can-Am era, where guys from Europe would come over on a regular basis and all that stuff. So I want to know if there was any driver in particular that stuck out to you as kind of above the rest, because I know that a lot of drivers did it. It wasn't a unique thing like it is now to have somebody come over from Europe. But out of all those guys, was there any in particular that you thought stood out?
Well, in the Can-Am, I was always a big fan of Dan Gurney. And I think a lot of the sports car aficionados like Dan Gurney. The simple fact that, he had a lot of personality. He went fast, and unfortunately, a lot of times he failed to finish, but he usually was out front when the car gave out. But he raced everything, raced Formula One, had his own cars, and so he was one of my favorites. But the Can-Am was really a spectacular era. I mean, these were fiberglass bodied cars with huge engines, and they didn't fit into any category. They called them Group 7 because they didn't have any other place to put them. And they attracted literally everybody from the racing world at one time or another. And if you saw the Can-Am, you saw just about everybody out of the history books that came in.
Yeah, that's honestly, it's astonishing how much that you have that we could just ask you about just because of the way that you moved around with racing at its height in some areas, and you saw the fall of stuff like Can-Am and stuff like that as well. Even getting into the split, you were part of that, watching that and stuff when it comes to IndyCar and kart. But I want to kind of talk about, you mentioned Ontario, and that is a racetrack that saw some finales for NASCAR championships. Most importantly, I think it was it 19. It was a Darrell Waltrip and Richard Petty battle for the end of a season championship at Ontario. I can't remember if it was 1979 or 76, but I have to ask, how was watching races at that Indy clone compared to what we saw at the beginning of the Brickyard 400 era?
Well, the reason it was different was because these were actual stock cars that raced there. This was before they went to the fabricated frames and that kind of thing. They were, they were the kind of cars you saw at Daytona, and so it was a different show than, say, the Brickyard. And I was very fortunate to see the first stock car race in Ontario, and was fortunate enough to see the first Brickyard too. But they were both extremely exciting. I was fortunate enough to see all the stock car races at Ontario, which was a track that, if it still existed, would probably still rank up there with the brand new tracks. I mean, they had elevators, and they had cocktail waitresses out in the concourse bringing drinks out to the fans, and that was pretty much unheard of in those days. I mean, it was an amazing track, and it's just a shame that it didn't continue to exist. Unfortunately, the joke was, at least among the media, when they said that racing was the sport of the 70s, that unfortunately the racing was the sport of the 60s, because, economically, those were some difficult times that came along, and racing took a lot of steps backward in terms of being able to get sponsorship, and the thing that kept the gates open. And TV really had not come along with the broadcast dollars. And so, if you didn't sell tickets, you really couldn't make the thing happen. Plus the fact that so many people borrowed money against the Ontario deal, is that by the time it was all said and done, nobody could really pay on the notes. And Southern California was moving eastward, and it became prime land, though ironically there's still about half the property that isn't developed.
Wow. That's actually pretty interesting. I know people talk about that in particular, and kind of how we're looking at Auto Club, whether or not it's going to be disappearing or shrinking due to the same sort of eastward expanse. But I do have to say, you hit something about the 70s. We had a gas crisis in the 70s, and seeing some of the massive amount of racing culture that was during the 60s and 70s firsthand, how did it affect, I guess, your enjoyment and your accessibility to racing when we started to have that gas crisis in the 70s?
Well, you had to be very careful when you went, when you're going to, we had odd even deals with buying fuel, and you had to figure out whether there's going to be gas stations even open if you had the right license plate. I remember one time going up to Monterey to an IMSA race, and it was kind of shaky getting up and back. But we had that same problem. I'm trying to remember when it was. I think it was with the hurricanes, closed down all the refineries down in Texas, and there was no gas in the southeast. And we were at Talladega, and we were having a heck of a time getting gas to go back to the airport in Atlanta. I don't know that it was Katrina, but it was sometime one of those that happened there. But yeah, the 70s, the one thing about the 70s that a lot of people don't realize is that two major manufacturers came along and saved racing in the 70s. And they may be controversial now. They weren't controversial then, but R.J. Reynolds saved NASCAR, and Marlboro saved IndyCar or kart or that. I mean, if those guys hadn't waded in with both feet and brought the sponsorship into the sport, I don't know that there would have been a sport by 1980.
That's really interesting to hear about how the gas crisis affected not only the cars in there, but the fans. I honestly didn't even think of the fans not being able, some of them, kind of being short on gas, and you really have to take that into account when you're traveling. You had mentioned Winston and kind of how they helped keep the doors open, so to speak. What was it like in that area, the 60s and the 70s, when we really saw sponsorships kind of become super popular in motor racing, as far as like the series banners, and not only that, but like the teams got a huge influx of money from some of these. What was it like going through that kind of growing era as far as money wise in the sport?
Well, it took off, but it was a double-edged sword, because when all that money came in, you know how racers are. If you get $10 in, you're going to spend 20, and that's sort of what they did. And you saw it kind of culminate in NASCAR anyway, with having to come up with this new car to try to figure out a way to save the owners from themselves. And I think so far it's kind of looking like it did. But when Winston and Marlboro got into racing, I think they brought other consumer sponsors in because they saw that racing was getting much more popular, and they saw that they could get the sponsorship to sell product out there, and not just oil and tires and cars. I mean, back in the 80s, for example, you couldn't go into a grocery store and not see some kind of a stand-up in there, particularly in the southeast, of a driver hawking this, that, or the other, and they weren't the kind of products that you would figure men would buy. They were Crisco and some of those other kitchen items, groceries. And unfortunately, I think that they've gotten away from that to direct to consumer sponsorship. I know there's a lot of business to business sponsorship now, and it's kept the teams in business, but it really hasn't done a lot to develop sponsors, the fan side of the equation, like it did. I mean, everybody had to have a favorite jacket of their race car driver, and those jackets usually had some kind of a product on it, and you don't have that now.
Right.
Yeah, I did want to ask about that a little bit. So sponsor activation, you brought that up. That's non-existent, basically now at the racetracks. I mean, obviously we had COVID, so that could have just been deleted basically because of that. But I remember when I was a kid, growing up in the boom era, going to tracks between like the early 2000s all the way to the 2010s, there were booths for every sponsor, even sponsors that weren't even on cars or on the walls at the racetrack. You could show up, you could try their products, you could get some merch from them, from free merch from them, whether it was bags, hats, whatever. How did you kind of see that in the early stages? How was sponsor activation other than just the tobacco sponsors at that era in the early 70s? How did that come to fruition, and how long did it take for you to see those other brands like the Crisco's and the Heinz and stuff that you had talked about come in?
Well, they all showed up at the racetrack, as you say. They all had booths. They all had activation. They all took media people out to dinner, and we had a lot of good dinners back then. But yeah, they activated like crazy. I mean, they activated where the customers went, whether it was on track or off track, and you saw banners everywhere. Welcome race fans. So, if a big race was coming to town, I guarantee you for 4, 6, 8 weeks ahead of time, you knew a race was coming.
So did that help out the sport more than it helped out the sponsorships, and getting them to have people more, buy more of their product or their service? Or do you think it was just a homogeneous kind of relationship where everybody was benefiting from it?
Well, everybody was scratching everybody else's back, so to speak. Rising tide raises all the boats, and that was what was happening in those days. And actually, it was happening when the TV audience was pretty fragmented, that you had this race on that particular channel and another race on another one. It was before the master sponsorship TV package came along in 2001.
And I guess kind of to take the conversation back a little bit, I should have asked this earlier, but I want to know a little bit about the glory days of racing, like you like to say, the 60s and 70s. It's well known that reliability with cars was a big thing back then, and you weren't guaranteed to finish a race like you might be today, barring a disaster. And obviously there were standout drivers, but are there any drivers that you think maybe deserved a little bit better equipment, or their results don't necessarily show how good they were?
Well, it's kind of hard to say. You had some James Hilton, for example, that finished second in the points, I think in 1966. He was the kind of guy that was really a good driver. But he was a master mechanic and a crew chief. He told me one time that he ran the whole 66 season with 2 cars and 2 engines, one engine in the car and one engine getting refreshed in the transporter. But there were a lot of guys like James, because there wasn't that much money in it in the 60s and 70s as far as the independents were concerned. There were a lot of guys that went fast, but they could only go as fast as they could afford to go. I mean, you had a lot of, start and park came along. That was a phrase that came along later, but you had guys that really were starting, and they would go as far as they could go. They could only afford to buy so much fuel. They could only afford to buy second, third-hand tires, takeoffs from the guys at the front of the field. And when they were done, and they went on to the next race. But in those days of the factories, you had only so many factory-sponsored cars, and then the rest of the guys were, they were left to their own devices. And it's a wonder that any of them did persevere. But I always used to say that the guys, particularly out of the South, that the idea of being a star race car driver was getting introduced to 30,000 fans cheering when you walked out for introductions, but nobody stood up and cheered when you clocked in at the mill. So that was one of the reasons that these guys kept doing it.
Mm-hmm. And to follow up on that, obviously, once the cars and the technology started to pick up, the money in the sport picked way up. So let's just say in a day where reliability maybe didn't matter as much as it used to, like let's just say the turbo era for F1, where they'd get a new engine every time they qualified, and certain things, even the Cup Series, you'd see technological improvements as well. Was there anything the drivers did to change, or were they just able to push that much harder knowing that everything they had was replaceable?
Well, when you had limited funds, if you broke cars and wrecked cars, you didn't last a long time being a driver. I mean, they were still going to the limits, but they knew where the limits were, and you didn't have to break too many engines before the owner said, well, that's it for you. Somebody else needs to get in here. But racing, to me, has changed a lot over the fact that the cars are completely bulletproof. 500-mile races were real endurance races because the cars weren't up to being driven that hard for that long. And you had a lot of people dropping out, and you didn't have people, driving 10 tenths the whole way either, because they literally could not. Either the cars wouldn't do it, or they couldn't afford to try to go 10 tenths. But yeah, it's a different era, and I've always maintained that you couldn't compare eras because everything's different. But I think the driver in this era is no different from a driver in another era. The only difference, particularly in stock car racing, was it ceased to become totally a southeastern oriented sport, and you had acceptance of drivers from other parts of the country. Now, granted, there were drivers from the Northeast that historically have been in NASCAR. Pete Hamilton, for one, from up in the Northeast. But West Coast drivers really were not accepted in stock car racing. Yeah, they came out and raced with them at Riverside, and there were some great West Coast drivers. In fact, they won races out here. But as far as getting a chance to race the full circuit in a factory car back east, that just wasn't happening. Although, ironically, some of the earliest drivers in NASCAR, such as Herschel McGriff, that was just recently voted into the NASCAR Hall of Fame, they were there from the very beginning. But it just didn't pan out that they became the well-known stars like the Pettys and the Pearsons and like that.
Let me flip through here. So you did mention Herschel McGriff, and Alex's dad Chad actually had a question about him. What was it like to see Herschel McGriff and a lot of those other West Coast stars from that era pull into a track to race against some of the locals? Was it a huge deal to see him pull in, or as far as the fans were concerned, was that those just other racers?
Well, they, for the most part, ran the what was then the Winston West circuit out here in California and Oregon, Washington, Canada. Uh, they didn't race those. You didn't get local guys racing in those cars. They were essentially cup cars, but they did, a number of them, race in the local divisions. They didn't just run the West Series because they had to make a living and they liked racing. So they'd race 12, 14 races in the West Series, and then the rest of the time they'd run at a local racetrack. But yeah, they the locals, I think they were probably a little bit more in awe of them when they came in. But once the awe wore off, they raced them just as hard. And, some of them, Jimmy Insolo, for example, was one driver that, he ran some of Petty's equipment at Riverside. And he was a real terror on the race, the local tracks, the half miles and the quarter miles. And he had a shot at going back east and probably having a factory ride, but he just decided he didn't want to do that because there really wasn't that much money in it. He could make more money doing what he was doing out here. And there were a lot of drivers that felt the same way. They didn't want to just go back and putter around the back of the field and get lapped every 10 laps.
So who were some of the guys from that area, maybe from the 70s to the 90s, that are well known down there, or that you thought were really big stars, but maybe either didn't get that shot at a cup ride, or like you said, either just turned it down because there wasn't quite the money involved? Who were a few of those guys?
Well, out on the West Coast, there were guys like Ray Elder and Jack McCoy, and Elder won 2 Riverside Cup races. McCoy won more West races, 51 races, than anybody else, and he would go to Riverside and he'd usually run in the top 5 until the engine gave up and or he crashed. You had guys later on, Bill Schmidt, and of course you got into the Chad Littles, and the Truck Series, I think, probably did more to bring the West Coast guys back to the attention of the East Coast guys, simply because you had Richard Childress having a team and having Mike Skinner, and of course Dale Earnhardt having Ron Hornaday Jr. And once they did that and saw that these guys could go out there and win races for East Coast teams, that all of a sudden they started looking and said, well, wait a minute, maybe we got a gold mine out here that hasn't been prospected yet. And so now you look at a lineup in a cup race and you see all kinds of people from California, Nevada, Colorado, that have worked their way not only in, but into championship in the Cup Series.
So, we talked at the start of the show that you were working for NASCAR for the Camping World Truck Series after you did some stuff with the Winston West Series. So, kind of want to move into your career now that we're a good halfway into the show. I want to ask a little bit not chronologically, but since we're talking about these truck series, you stated that you guys basically hit the gold mine with those racetracks, bringing them, I remember I think the first race was in Tucson and stuff like that. But I do want to ask, since you worked with the truck series up until, I believe, 2012, how do you feel the difference in, or I guess the shift in going from the local short tracks all across the country to being a basically second Xfinity series and following the Cup Series around like that? How do you feel that shifted I guess, the persona of the truck series? And do you think that basically running a third Cup style series was good for that series in particular?
Well, the theory behind the truck series to begin with was that it was not going to be an adjunct to any other series, really, that it was going to be a standalone series, that it was going to go around providing NASCAR type stars and NASCAR type racing to the weekly tracks, such as the ones on the West Coast, but we also were in the Midwest on the East Coast. So it had a pretty good footprint from the very beginning, but those were really fun times because we had a little tag along tech trailer that somebody pulled, and the trucks were really basically actual truck bodies that went onto a Cup style chassis. But we felt that we would build an interest in NASCAR at perhaps tracks that weren't NASCAR tracks, but that we'd get a lot of people to come out, and we'd create a series that would work for their sponsors, for Craftsman, and for others. And we did it for 3 or 4 or 5 years quite successfully. Until it became obvious that what it was going to cost to keep running this series, the purses that we had to pay, and the places that we could go could not afford it. And at that point, the decision had to be made. Are you going to keep the series going, or are you just going to say, well, it was fun, but we can't do this anymore? And that's where we became kind of a second or third division. But one thing you have to remember is that a Cup weekend generates a lot of dollars to the track operators.
Right.
Mhm.
And in doing so, they have the opportunity to not only put on the Cup race, but to put on the Xfinity races and the truck races and whatever else they do. But obviously, if they did not have the broadcast dollars, you probably noticed that about the time the TV contracts got signed with NBC and Fox, is that all of a sudden that the Xfinity series and the truck series gravitated over to the virtually all Cup weekends. And that's essentially dollars and cents. That what you had to pay to have a truck series race, you sure couldn't afford at Evergreen Speedway in Monroe, Washington. But from the very beginning, we did have some truck races that were second tier events. So Richmond was very in the first season. Was very successful. We also ran at Phoenix with the Cup Series there for our season finale. So it wasn't unprecedented that we went to the Cup races, and we went to Martinsville and North Wilkesboro as a number 2 division as well. So the history is there that we were with the Cup Series, but certainly it wasn't intended necessarily to go that direction.
So you bring up a great point and kind of led me into this. I do have a follow-up question to the statement here, but last year we went through and I made a fantasy truck schedule of what I think the truck series should morph into, something closer along to what we saw in the mid-late 90s when it first came out. And that was, we have a touring schedule similar to the World Outlaws where we race 60, 70 times a year, but we do it in increments along, through the Midwest, through the West Coast, and then eventually swing back to the East and kind of circle around. So that way trucks weren't having to be shuttled out all the way to, say, Kern County in California, and then back to Charlotte, and then out to Denver, and then back. I've always been a really big fan of that. I always wish that I was just a little bit older so I could have gone down to Colorado National Speedway, just north of Denver, and seen the trucks run. I actually held the closest finish in NASCAR history up until a couple years ago between Butch Miller and Mike Skinner. But do you think something like that could work in this era where we see a lot of streaming, a lot of like Flow Racing, Mav TV, etc., giving people the access on their phones, to whereas you might not need a ton of broadcasting rights on a big cable network to pay for a lot of those purses? Because I do see a lot of dirt series doing pretty well with that.
Well, and one of the reasons that the dirt series do well is that they've got a huge back gate. And that back gate subsidizes a lot of things that get done at those racetracks with the big shows. I mean, you're familiar with the number of people that go in the back gate at an Outlaws race, and also probably the dirt races as well. So there's one thing. We don't historically, with stock car racing or Indy car racing for that matter, have open garages, although it seemed like with cup races there for a while that literally everybody was in the garage area, and that's why they had to cut it back and have hot passes and that kind of thing. But I think that what you're talking about would be fun, but I don't know under the current circumstances whether it would work too well, particularly with the number of races that we do, and really for the teams to be able to afford. I mean, that's one of the reasons the Truck Series only runs 23 races compared to 36 races for Xfinity and Cup.
Yeah, and
I will tell you a story about that race at Denver. It was funny because there was I don't know if it was a college World Series game or whatever, but we were sitting up there and we were waiting for CBS to go live, and of course the game wasn't over and it was going into extra innings, and we were trying to tell the fans that this thing wasn't going to quite happen, and we had pace car going around. We finally got the race underway, and there was that fantastic finish, but we didn't have electronic scoring or anything like that in those days. And we just I would usually time the finish with my stopwatch. Well, I'm up there and I hit the stopwatch, and, it looked like about, 100th of a second or something like that. And I turned around to my boss at the time and said, well, it looks like a 100th of a second. And he said, well, it had to be closer than that. And I said, well, I don't know. Was it 1,000th of a second? And he said, well, I don't know. Maybe it was 10,000 of a second. I said, okay, well, fine. We'll just put that on the race report. Yeah. And it went down for I don't know how many years, 10, 12 years before we finally admitted that that was not the closest finish in history. But we said it, we put on the race report in the timed scoring era. We had a lot of stuff like that went on in those days. It was pretty. It was a long time before electronic scoring, and we didn't have they didn't have transponders, and you were at the mercy of a lap score to tell you who was running where.
Well, I've been telling people that's the closest finish in history for 20 years, so I'm going to keep going now that I know the story behind it.
So it seems like you've been a PA announcer for your local short tracks for quite a while, and I want to know about your experience as a broadcaster or just PA announcer, and just tell us a little bit of how that went and what you liked or disliked about doing it.
Well, here's the deal. All of the things that I've gotten myself involved in, I've sort of walked in the front door and say, hey, give me a chance. I will do it for nothing. And it's how I got my first newspaper job. It's how I got my first race writing job. It's how I got my first wave the flags at the sports car races job. I'd started this column in a local throwaway newspaper 3 times a week, the shopper. And I was writing the column, and they saw that I had an interest, and they needed a PR person. So they said, "Hey, would you be interested in doing that?" I said, "Sure, fine. I'll come out, go to the races." They'd give me a handful of passes to pass out at the supermarket and the bank and all that. And they give me a roll of stamps, and they paid me $35 a week. Well, that was great. But then the announcer quit, and they said, "Well, would you like to be the announcer?" And so I got in being the announcer. And at the same time, they had the sports car races needed an announcer. And they said, "Well, would you like to do turn 6 or whatever at the racetrack?" I said, "Sure, I'll do that." And so that was kind of how I got into the announcing thing. I was doing a little bit of radio work. I did some freelance stuff for Buck Owens' radio station in Bakersfield, and met some very interesting people. But yeah, I enjoyed the announcing side, but unfortunately, I never really had the voice for the bass voice for the announcing. I really envy those guys that have that kind of timbre.
Yeah. I've had a lot of experience working at racetracks and stuff like that, with my dad being a flagman, doing some race directing, stuff like that. I do want to ask you, though, interestingly enough, you told us when we were talking a few weeks ago that you worked at the Marin Raceway, and also at the other Bakersfield track, Bakersfield Speedway. I did want to ask, Marin is now kind of iconic for their late model series. They even have MAV TV showing some of their weekly races throughout the summer. Was that track and maybe even Bakersfield Speedway kind of like a mecca for late model racing in the California and other West Coast area?
Well, Marin hasn't existed for a while. They unfortunately sold out to housing. The people that owned the racetrack decided to take the money and depart, and I don't blame them. Now the racetrack that's currently there, Kern County Speedway, is a lot like Mace Marin, except on steroids. But Mace Marin, during its heyday from 1977 until, I'm thinking it was like 2005, 2006, and there was when they closed. But yeah, it was. They had some of the best late model stock car racing going on a weekly basis. And a lot of the guys that we're talking about, the Kevin Harvicks and the Bushes and the Hornadays, they're the ones that came up and raced and made names for themselves at the racetrack. But the funny part about it is Mace Marin was built for the fact that here's a little backstory on how Mace Marin got built. A guy by the name of Pete Collins built a mini stock. They had a mini stock division out at the Bakersfield Speedway. And he built this thing, and I don't guess he got a rule book or something, but he showed up at the back gate with it, and they looked at it, and they said, "Well, there's no way we're going to let this thing race out here. It's totally illegal. Take it home." Well, he got together with his brothers that had a big tire business in the county. And they said, "Well, doggone it, they won't let you race out there. We'll build our own racetrack." So sure enough, they went out there and they bought the land, but cheap. There was nothing out there on the east side. And they bought it cheap. They did the work themselves. They graded it. They surveyed it. They built the stands, built the plumbing and the whole deal. And that's how Mace Marin got built. And that's how The fact that it stayed open as long as it did because they had no real investment in it except the sweat labor, and they had no notes to pay. And but at its zenith, I mean, the fact is that there probably wouldn't have been a truck series without their help. The Collinses had one of the first demonstration races, and the demonstration truck was built in Gary Collins's shop, and it was a great facility, and I had the opportunity to be the announcer out at that racetrack and the PR man too at one time or another. In fact, first race. So I think I was an announcer out there for 3 different sets of promoters.
Yeah, different era for sure. So I got to jump back just a little bit. So we're all either still in or just out of college. What was college like in the late 60s? I know you went to the University of Missouri. What was the college scene like in the late 60s, and just how much trouble did you and your buddies get into?
Well, I guess the statute of limitations has run out on that one, but it's nothing like college was now. I mean, this was the tail end in the 50s. This was the tail end of the post-war generation, and I think that a couple of years before I got into a fraternity back there, that they had just outlawed paddling, but there was still a lot of shenanigans that were going on, and a lot of beer drinking going on, and it was and you know, the typical college, you had beer joints all the way around the campus. You had them on at least 2 sides, maybe 3 sides of the campus, and one right on campus. You know, I don't know if you ever heard the song "The Green Door." What's behind the green door? Well, there was a bar that was right outside the campus building, the administration building, that had the green door on. Whoever wrote that song apparently spent a few idle hours behind the green door.
Yeah.
And yeah, college, I don't know. I see these athletes all getting through college with degrees in 3 years, and I'm thinking, boy, I wish that had been the case back when I was in college, because it didn't seem like you'd matriculate that quickly.
Yeah.
I'm saying that they don't have easier courses now, but never mind.
So
fun days. They were fun days.
Yeah. With that one, we actually had a fan submit a question. This one comes from Dakota about the Daytona Beach scene in the 80s. So since you were working for the sport during the late 80s, did you have the ability to take in the beach scene at all? And if so, what was it like?
Well, we were racing from dawn to into the evenings, and we didn't have much time to go take the beach scene in. We did stay at hotels down on the beach, but they weren't necessarily the hotels where people were partying. I don't recall there being that much in terms of actual partying. You know, that was bike week and spring break in Daytona, but Daytona 500 was more families and that. I don't remember a whole lot of carrying on, although that's not to say there probably wasn't.
Yeah,
but it didn't spill over into the streets like it did with bike week and spring break.
I'm sure Talladega was always just as crazy.
Yeah, went the first time that I went to Talladega, I won. I'm trying to remember exactly. It was a pick the winner contest that they had that media people participated in, and I won the contest being on the West Coast, which I'm sure, you know, bothered some of the writers on the East Coast. But one of the prizes was an all-expense paid trip to Talladega. So a buddy of mine and I, we got on an airplane, went to Talladega, and it was interesting because the week before the IndyCar, the kart race at Atlanta had been rained out. So we got 2 for the price of 1. We got to go to Talladega, and we took off on Saturday and went over to Atlanta and watched the IndyCar race. But I remember us driving out of the parking lot on Saturday. It had rained down there, as it usually does in the spring, and there was mud all over the place. And there were these guys out there just mudding it up, no clothes on, carrying on. And I said, man, this we didn't have this in California. But I was always told that you definitely did not want to go to the campground across the street. I never went to that place.
It's actually funny that you bring up that spring stuff. Go ahead, Nate.
Yeah, so kind of a completely different topic, but it's something that I kind of forgot to cover because we kind of got lost in conversation earlier about the 60s and the golden era. And I wanted to ask you about the evolution of the sport because everyone knows the cars evolved, but it seems like the drivers had to evolve too to go with it when it comes to fitness and preparation and everything really that they did off the track. And when did you start to notice a shift toward that, and what did they have to do differently?
I think that probably it came with the when kart really started getting popular and the cars got very sophisticated and the teams got sophisticated, that I think that a lot of the exercise, the cardio, maybe not so much the lifting, but particularly the cardio came into being with that. And I think it carried over from Formula One. But I think that it didn't really get into popularity in NASCAR until, I'm going to tell you, probably the mid to late 80s, 90s. I don't think anybody was lifting a whole lot, at least the guys that I knew that raced. I don't think they ever saw the inside of a gym. They probably saw the inside of a few saloons, but the 12-ounce curls, candidly. Yeah. But no, it did change, and the drivers got very, very serious about what they were doing. And not that they weren't serious before, but I mean, they had contracts with teams, and the team said, okay, you're going to have to do the fitness thing. And they had, it evolved into what they have now with the weight training and, with the pit crews, the same thing with that. But yeah, it definitely, if you look at the photos that were taken at racetracks of drivers back in the 50s, 60s, 70s, they don't look anything like the fit drivers that you see now.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. I think that's interesting because it begs the question to me, is motorsports nowadays more, I guess, intense? Not only from a fitness, but a mental fitness and awareness kind of standpoint, because they have to do so much off the track rather than just rely on their talents on the track, compared to when motorsports started booming in that late 60s, early 70s era, where you were just those, daredevil hero guys. You weren't necessarily a piece of manufactured talent and skill like we have today.
Well, they didn't have the engineering that they have these days, the sophistication and the way that the cars are built, and how they set them up. I mean, if you go back to the 60s, 70s, and the guys are carrying springs around and eyeballing the spring and saying, yeah, that's the one to use. I mean, it was eyeball engineering, and the fact of the matter was that a lot of these guys that had no education whatsoever were some of the greatest engineers in the sport. It's too bad that they weren't running government programs. But yeah, I don't think Smokey Unick probably never took an engineering course in his life, but he could tell you right down to the millimeter what the car was doing and what it was doing. But the drivers back in that era, for the most part, they came to the racetrack and drove. They didn't build the cars. Well, the independents did, but the factory cars, they had crews. They had guys that worked on the cars. They told the drivers, in essence, that you're here to drive. Don't tell us how to build the car. And we won't tell you how to drive. Of course, the crew chief, Junior Johnson probably told him how to drive. Some of the great stories that Darrell Waltrip and Junior Johnson, those tales were kind of legendary. But yeah, it's you have to be very, very much more knowledgeable to be able to, in fact, tell the engineers and the crew chiefs what the car is doing. They just spitballed it back in those days. It's pushing, it's loose. Nowadays, that doesn't tell them anything.
Yeah. It's very interesting to see kind of the evolution of everything. Nathan, go ahead.
Oh, I didn't have any comments. You covered it all. Okay.
All right. So kind of getting back to your career and less of the actual racing and stuff. You worked in the Winston West. You worked at all these other tracks. We talked about your truck series stuff, but I have to know from a standpoint of you working, I guess, in 2013 and 2014, the last thing you do, what does the sports service manager role, what does that mean, and what did you do with that title while working for NASCAR?
Well, what I was trying to do was transition out of going to the racetrack every weekend. My wife wasn't well, and I needed to probably spend more time at home. The electronic scoring had finally got sophisticated enough that they hooked it up to the PR staff so that you could access by laptop what the electronic scoring was doing and generate periodic reports through the race, but also pre-race, post-race, and be able to service the media. So I would go to the track and I would set up my laptop and make sure that I had all the correct information in it on the drivers, crew chief, sponsors, and which awards you qualified for and that sort of thing. And that's what I would do at the track. I would sit there and watch my computer and try to let the media know exactly what was going on. And then after the race, generate the reports that had to go here, there, and everywhere. And that was essentially what I did for a couple of years. And I was able to cut it back so that I could go to most of the tracks, the races that were from the Mississippi west, rather than go a lot to the ones in the east. Although I did do a number of, I did Pocono, I did Atlanta, I did Daytona with it. I did most of the tracks. I did Chicago, and I did. I did before I kind of cut it back to the West Coast stuff. And but that was one of the things that when I was just getting involved in NASCAR, I said, boy, that would be really great to be a PR person and go around and see all the racetracks and go to all the places. And I had never really been east of Missouri. So I didn't know what was going on back there. And, everything seemed like all these exotic names in North Carolina, South Carolina, where all these drivers were from. And that was the thing that when I wanted to go to all the racetracks. And by the time I was done, I went to every NASCAR track that was on the schedule in the post dirt track era. That was I thought that was quite a feat.
That's
So
awesome.
you had mentioned up until you really started traveling around, you had never been east of the Missouri. What was the culture shift like as compared West Coast to East Coast?
Well, it was different, but I was fortunate to be in with a bunch of guys that were essentially East Coast, Southern people. In fact, I worked before I, started traveling. I'd go to Daytona every year for meetings and like that. But I had some pretty good friends and colleagues that kind of clued me into what the culture was back there. And, I'm not sure if you know who Wayne Otten is, who is the director of the Xfinity series, but he was the director of the Truck series, and he and I worked hand in hand through most of the years of the Truck series that we were both there. And he was a great mentor as far as the South was concerned. Great guy, probably one of the smartest directors that I've ever seen around the racetrack, able to balance the needs of the drivers, the car owners, the sanctioning body, the promoters. Hardworking guy, racing NASCAR, particularly one of the very, very invaluable people that they could have possibly brought on board.
So I do want to ask here. You worked communications for the Winston West for several years, just over a decade, and you mentioned that you visited tracks throughout the whole West Coast, a lot of California, Nevada, Oregon, Washington, Arizona, Idaho, New Mexico, and you threw Wyoming in there. What are some of the tracks you've been to that maybe some other racing fans might not know as well? And what the hell track did you end up going to in Wyoming? Because there
Went
ain't
to a place called Sweetwater Speedway, which was just east of Green River. I flew in on a puddle jumper from Denver, and I'd never even, I think I'd been up into the corner of Wyoming when I worked in the summer up at Yellowstone Park in a gas station, and I had relatives in northeastern Utah, but this was someplace that I never thought that I would be.
right.
It's right out in the middle of nowhere. Kind of an interesting place. I know that when I was there, the wind blew from all corners of the compass at one time or another.
Yep.
But it was a fun different race.
Yeah, it is interesting. Nate,
Hold on, I had to pull up.
I was gonna pull up his notes.
I wasn't really ready for it, so
I keep trying to tell these guys how often the wind blows here. It's crazy.
yeah, they hear about it all the time. One on a follow up with all your stuff with NASCAR. Even after all the years after you've been inducted into the Hall of Fame for the West Coast Stock Car Hall of Fame, and after you've kind of winded down a little bit, do you still feel like NASCAR is trending upward, or do you think that there are some things that need to be changed to help do the sport a little more justice?
Well, I'd probably be the last one to tell them how to run NASCAR. But I think it's trending up. I think that there have been some times that have been difficult. I think 2007, 2008 economic situation really hurt the sport. I think that, it's probably obvious that a lot of the expansion that they did in the 90s did not pan out. Chicago closed, and Kentucky closed, and I don't think it caught on quite the way they hoped it would. I think they felt like the TV contracts would probably boost the sport a lot, and I think they did. But the problem is, once again, that economic depression, or whatever you want to call it, there, when everybody's losing their houses and things like that, it hurt, and the sponsorship hurt. The fact that there wasn't any. But I think I think the new car has definitely helped. I think it's brought some new people into the sport, particularly on the ownership side, because it's no secret that the ownership in NASCAR is, they're my age.
Yeah.
And that's, but now you're getting some younger people in there. Hendrick has got Jeff Gordon involved in the ownership, and you've got Brad Keselowski getting involved over in the Roush side. And you've got the new teams coming in, that a couple of brand new teams, and I think there's even going to be others that want to come in and get involved. I would say that it's looking up, and I think that the number of people going to the races has probably come up. I think the attendance is back on an upswing, and so it's tough out there.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, everybody forgets that in the 60s and 70s that the footprint of the stick and ball sports was not what it is now. You didn't have all these expansion teams. You didn't have pro football and pro basketball in Charlotte. You didn't have a lot of the different entertainment activities that are going on now, that you have to split the fan base with, and you've got all kinds of videos and streaming and TV, cable, whatever, that split the audience to the point that boy, if you do a 2-0 on TV on Sunday, boy, that's great. When it used to be, if you didn't do a 5 or a 5.5, what happened? So I think you have to look through it through a different lens than, say, you would look at it. A lot of people say, well, NASCAR forgot the old timers, and they tried to make it into something different. But you have to realize that with anything, I heard a great quote on a TV show the other night, said, well, if you like what's happening right now, take a picture of it and put it in your scrapbook, because it isn't going to stick around. You've got to try to stay ahead of the curve, as it were. And it's, you no longer have the drivers from, funny places in the South that talk strange, and you can, sell it like, boy, this is a great thing to go watch these guys, these, moonshiners and all that. Well, it hasn't been that way for forever. And, it's a different deal, and it's a different sell.
Yeah. Well, about looking at stuff through different lenses, you are definitely someone who has looked through every lens in the motorsports book, from anywhere between fandom to even just being a little bit on the corporate office side. I want to get into some of the things. So you're not just a fan. You're not just someone who worked in the world of motorsports. You're actually a Hall of Famer. You're in the West Coast Stock Car Hall of Fame, and you won the Jim Chapman Award last year. So I guess firstly, I want to ask what the Jim Chapman Award meant to you. And then secondly, did you enjoy the writing aspect or the PR/corporate aspect of your career more?
Well, I am extremely honored to even be mentioned for the Chapman Award because Jim Chapman. Uh, if you Google him and read what he did in the field of public relations and some of the people who he rubbed elbows with, unbelievable guy to be honored with something with his name on it. Certainly is a capper for a public relations career. So and further to that he was involved with pretty much CART, and a lot of the people that won this award were involved with IndyCar, open wheel, Indianapolis 500. So I feel almost like an interloper coming in there as a West Coast guy, but tremendous accolade, and I'm still not quite certain that I was deserving of it, but if they say I was, well, then I definitely am happy to accept the award.
So
go ahead, Nathan. I'm sorry.
Yeah, that's fine. But when it comes to the induction ceremony, I believe it's June 9th, if my outline is correct here, for the West Coast Stock Car Hall of Fame.
Right.
I want to know who all are going to be the inductees and what are you going to do there for the ceremony?
Well, you should have brought out my list. But anyway, some of the inductees that we've got going in, you caught me without my list, and if you wait for just a second, I might be able to grab the list. Okay. We have Greg Biffle.
Wow.
We have Garrett Evans. Garrett Evans was our first Northwest Tour champion, won the most races of anybody in the Northwest. He's also a promoter. Brendan Gaughan, I think all of you know who Brendan Gaughan is. Trucks, Xfinity, Cup, off-road. David Gilliland, his father, Butch, is also in our Hall of Fame, and he was Butch's crew chief when Butch won a couple of the West championships. We have a gentleman by the name of John Moore, who is a track champion and also has been very involved in sponsorship of races and racers in Northern and Central California. And on the open wheel side, we've got Jimmy Sills, Buckwheat, who has won a lot of races, championships, competed in the World of Outlaws, 2 Silver Crown championships. So they are the main voted in inductees.
So how does it feel? I did pull up a list of the West Coast Stock Car Hall of Fame members. How does it feel to be in the same company as a lot of these guys on the list? Some of the guys that you grew up watching and covering in the beginning of your career. Guys like Dan Gurney, even some really big names in the NASCAR world, Mike Kerr, Rod Osterlund, Marvin Panch, Joe Ruttman, and then Bob Bondurant for all that he's done for the world of racing. How does it feel for you to be in the same company and category as a lot of these guys?
Well, it's quite an honor, particularly to be with the guys that really that I I can't say I necessarily idolized them because, as a media person, you really got to kind of maintain some distance. But I look at it in this sense that there have been very few media people inducted into this Hall of Fame. And I really feel proud, for example, to be inducted after Shav Glick, who was a great friend and a just tremendous auto racing writer for the Los Angeles Times, covered virtually everything motorized. So I think I really look at it in that sense of being a media person, and so I can't really compare being a racer, because the few times that I've tried to race, I finally got out of the car and told the drivers I'd make a deal. I won't drive any more race cars if you don't write any stories.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, it's pretty amazing. You've got to see and just enormous amount of things in your life. You got to do a lot of stuff, and I mean, I want to congratulate you on getting inducted into the West Coast Stock Car Hall of Fame, as well as winning that Chapman Award last year. I mean, just you have been a standout guest for us. We really appreciate you coming on and hanging out with us tonight. It was very educational for the three of us. I'm sure it was educational for everyone who's watching online on all of our platforms. I want to thank all you guys for watching online. Colton, Nathan, do you guys have any final questions?
I don't really have any questions. I just want to thank him for coming on, and congratulations on your induction.
Yeah, I'm right in that same boat. It was an honor to have you on. Great conversation, some really great stories, stuff I never would have learned about.
Yeah. So thanks again.
Well, I'm really happy that you invited me on here to be able to share some of my yarns, and it's been a great ride, and I really appreciate you taking the time to give me this great forum.
Well, no, we appreciate you for coming on. One thing that we do at Fan Fuel that's a little bit different than a lot of the other podcasts or your traditional media sites is we ask you if there's any questions that you have for the three of us. So when we leave off, we always ask that. So are there any questions that you have for us as younger fans?
Well, I don't know I have so much question as I really appreciate the fact that as the younger generation, seeing that the sport has merit, that you hear that kids don't like cars anymore, and that's one of the reasons that attendance is down at the racetracks and on and on and on. But it's the fact that you guys not only have taken an interest, but to gone as far as you have with the podcast and with other things you do that is related to the motorsports industry. It's great just to see that, and I'm sure that you're not the only young folks that are interested in racing, because when I go to the track, I see plenty of people that are in their 20s and 30s. It's just not old folks.
Yeah, we certainly are trying, and one of the things that the three of us really want to do is learn as much as we can about the history of the sport. So I really do appreciate you coming on, because there's some stuff that we probably would have never known. And thank you for bamboozling me that one day that I was scrolling on Twitter, and I was like, I got to get this guy on because he's been to Riverside. Because it's been a phenomenal conversation for the last hour and a half. Thanks for giving us your time tonight. And then I guess we'll have a good night. I'll sign off, and we'll see everybody next week. I want to go ahead and thank everybody for watching on Facebook, on YouTube, and on Twitch. I want to thank for everyone who commented on Twitter and Facebook this week while we were asking you questions that you wanted to give to Owen. And come out and see us, as always, next Wednesday at 7:30. We'll have something special cooked up for next week's show as well. And again, thank you, Owen, for coming on, and we will see all of you guys next week.
Thanks, guys.